So our next speaker is Mandy. Mandy's a lead software engineer at Octopus Deploy. And I met Mandy many years ago. I don't even remember what conference it was, but we met at some conference. And I just have to say, I feel really bad for every speaker that's coming after her because she's about to drop the best slides that you have ever seen. Everyone else is gonna pale in comparison. But she's a fantastic designer, and she's here to talk about font perf strategies so that you don't end up making one of those 17 mistakes that Paul shared with us yesterday. All right, welcome, Mandy.
Thank you. Thank you. Now I feel pressure about my slides. If you can't tell from my accent, I am Australian. One of the things about Australia is that we have all these really dangerous creatures. And as a result of that, we kind of have developed this fear response where instead of getting all panicky, we just get really chill and relaxed because that's what you do in front of big, scary things. So if I look really relaxed right now, I'm not. I'm just employing that defense mechanism so that I can talk to you about fonts. I'm really hoping that you enjoy my talk. If you don't get anything out of it, the consolation prize is a picture of my dog. This is Jello. And if you want to talk to me about Jello or, fonts, I'm on Mastodon and Blue Sky. And as I said, my name is Mandy. I work for a company called Octopus Deploy, which is based in Australia. And we sort of aim to automate and simplify complex deployments. But I'm not going to be talking about that. I am going to be talking about fonts. And the thing to know about me is that I really love text. And I've played around with text a lot on the web, mostly just for funsies. So this is kind of more of a passion of mine than anything. And I think what I find so fascinating about text on the web is it's something that every website has. And we often just kind of whack it in and don't really think that much about it because it just kind of works. But as a result of text being so fundamental, fonts have become a really big part of the web as well, whether you're explicitly adding one or not. And it didn't always used to be this way. Many years ago, if you've been around that long, we used to have things like Kufon and Cipher to try and get our fonts, which were awful. But then we got web fonts, and about 87% of all websites now use web fonts, according to the HTTP archive. And that means that 87% of all websites really should be considering, the performance impacts of loading those resources. Now, there are two main areas that fonts impact: the largest contentful paint and the cumulative layout shift. And we'll sort of talk about those as we go through. And the changes that we're going to make will have the biggest impact to these two areas. I will be referencing the Web Font Almanac, which a couple of other people have mentioned. It's a really great resource. I highly recommend you check it out. Lots of really interesting data. And I'll be referencing that data as we talk about these four main areas: hosting, number of fonts, font file sizes, and display and loading. Now, I said I like text, and I've got 3 blog posts about websites about text, various things, update sporadically. But I made these while I was on maternity leave, so terrible choices were made. Probably the worst work I've ever done in my life, except for maybe that Backstreet Boy website I made when I was 13. The fonts on this are absolutely horrendous, and I'm deeply ashamed by it. And we'll get to the slide of my shame soon, but I'm going to use it as an example of what not to do, and then we'll go through and try and fix them. Now, keep in mind, it is a blog, and I'm based in Australia, and my server's in the US, so the timings are all whack. It takes an extra 300 milliseconds for a request, because it's down under. But let's just focus on the percentages. Now, I'm going to show you how it loads on a really slow 4G connection. Slow Poofball was total accidental from Tabby Cat, but I thought it was funny. So this is my website loading, and the fonts haven't loaded yet. And they've not loaded yet. Still haven't loaded. It's still not. Oh, there goes the heading, and there goes the body text. It's a really long time on a slow connection, so hopefully we can make this a little bit better. Now, in the grand scheme of websites, these numbers aren't particularly terrible, but we can make them better, especially that page weight, which we'll get to in a minute. Now, our main goal is going to be how we can get the best font performance we can on our websites. And there is 100% surefire way to do that, and that is to not use web fonts at all and to use system fonts instead. Now, a system font basically refers to a font that's installed on the computer, and its aim is to match the typeface of your website to the operating system UI. So for a Mac, that would be SF Pro. For Windows, it's Segoy UI. For Linux, it's like Ubuntu and a bunch of others. There's a bunch of different fonts depending on the system. If we go back to the strategies, none of these matter if you use system fonts because there's no font file, so you don't have to worry about any of that. But the biggest problem with system fonts is that they lack consistency across browsers. As you can see, they're all different widths and boldness. So when you choose to use a system font, you're handing your design choices over to the operating system, and that may or may not be a good option for you. You also need to make sure that your UI can handle that discrepancy in width, otherwise you'll have some bad times. Now on TextLab, I can eliminate the layout shift because there's no fonts, and my layout shift was completely caused by my really awful fonts. And I can reduce the largest contentful paint by a bit just by switching to system fonts. So it might be a good choice for you if you don't have to worry about branding or any of that kind of thing. So if custom typography is not a big deal to you, system fonts might be the right choice. We at Octopus Deploy actually switched to system fonts very recently. So if you want to talk about that and the ins and outs of it, please come speak to me afterwards. I know all about it. But it does erase the need for any kind of performance strategies. However, if custom typography is important to you, these are not going to be a good choice. So that's what we're going to look at for the rest of the talk. With that out of the way, the first thing that you really need to think about is whether you are going to use a third party or you're going to self-host. So third parties being like Google Fonts, which is by far the most popular third party for fonts that exists. Now, according to the Web Font Almanac, about 70% of all websites across desktop and mobile use a self-hosted font in some capacity, whether that's exclusively a self-hosting or using it in combination with Google Fonts. It's much lower numbers for only self-hosting and only a third party, and there has been more of a shift to using self-hosted fonts over the last few years since the last Almanac was released. Could be a number of reasons for the mixed approach, like legacy fonts or a font not being available in Google Fonts, so you need to self-host that one. But one of the biggest reasons that is speculated about the reason that people are moving to self-hosting is because it used to be that when you used a third party, like Google Fonts, you would get the benefit of cross-site caching. So basically, if two different websites loaded the same font, it would only be downloaded the once. But about 2020-ish, this was removed from Chrome and Firefox, and that's because it was possible to track users across websites using cache side channel attacks, so security risk. As a result, the benefit of having that caching is no longer available. So when you use a third party, all you're doing is adding the cross-origin request to your critical path, which is not great for our performance. And additionally, you get some tracking when you use a third party as well, which also isn't great for privacy. That said, privacy stuff aside for a moment, the decision I think about which is better really depends on what you're willing to do. If you want to dump something in your page and you don't want to spend time optimizing the fonts and you don't want to listen to anything that I say today, Google Fonts might be a better choice for you, and the reason for that is that they put a lot of effort into optimizing. Google Fonts are about half the size of the average font file size that self-hosted fonts are, so you might get better performance here if you're not willing to do anything else. That said, realistically, self-hosting is the better choice for performance. It's better for privacy. So if you're willing to put the effort in, this is definitely the way to go. Now, related to your decision about what hosting you want to do, it's really about the number of fonts that you want to use from that. Whether you're self-hosting or using Google Fonts, it's the same question. The less fonts you have to download, the quicker things are going to be. Now, how many you need largely depends on your design. If you have different heading and body fonts, you might have somewhere between 5 and 6 fonts covering bold, italic, regular, and so on. What is really important from my perspective, yes, try and keep the fonts low. I'm not going to tell you how many families to use. That's between you and your designer. I like typography, so I'm not going to put a restriction on that. But it is important that you only load in the fonts that you need. When we were switching to system fonts at Octopus Deploy, I was doing an audit of the site, and I came across this section where we're rendering a Google login button, and we were loading the entire Roboto font family in TrueType fonts, which are very big, just to render a single button. That was well over 2 meg worth of fonts for no reason at all. So make sure you're only loading in what you need. Don't just whack everything in there and leave it at that. Now, another way to reduce the number of fonts that you need is to use variable fonts, which is something that I'm a big fan of. They're very well supported. They've been around for a while. And if you're not familiar with what a variable font is, it basically combines multiple styles of a family into a single font file. This eliminates the need for multiple files. And it does this by creating an axis, for example, a weight axis. It'll create a master instance like bold and regular, and then it'll generate interpolated values in between that, giving you a much wider range of options to choose from. But it doesn't just apply to one axis. You can have thousands of axes. That would be a huge font, but you can have thousands of them. And the interpolation applies to the combination of the axes as well. Now, the reason that I mention this is because you're probably thinking, well, that's going to be a really huge file. And it is true that a single variable font tends to be larger than a single individual font file, but typically they're better than the combination of all of the font styles that you would have on a page. Part of the reason for this is because in a single font file, there's a lot of data that has to be repeated each time, whereas when you have a variable font, that is shared across all the styles. So for example, a single weight of Source Sans Pro is 107 kilobytes. The combined of regular and bold is 214. And a single variable font for Source Sans Pro is 166 kilobytes. That makes the combined 22% larger than the variable font. Now, this might not always be the case. Sometimes they're larger, sometimes they're smaller. It does depend on the font. But it's worth checking out to see if you can make some savings by using a variable font. Right now, about 33% of all websites use variable fonts. Unfortunately, this is predominantly because of Google. They switched their most popular font families to Google Fonts a few years ago. About 93% of variable font usage is from them. So if you are self-hosting and you're not using a variable font, it might be worth checking to see if you can get any reduction in your file sizes by doing that. Now, with that in mind, the next thing I want to talk about is making our font files smaller. The smaller the file size, the quicker it's going to load. So according to the Web Font Almanac, the average font size is about 40 kilobytes. This is actually bigger than it was in the last almanac, so fonts are getting larger. And it doesn't sound so bad, but all this kind of adds up, especially if you've got multiple font files. And the easiest way to reduce your file sizes is to use better formats. In this example of Source Sans Pro Regular, the TrueType font is 75% larger than the WOF2, and this is because WOF2 is compressed by default, whereas TrueType fonts are not. According to the Web Font Almanac, thankfully the majority of us are using WOF2. However, we still have a bit of WOF and some TrueType fonts around on the web. If you're still using WOF and not WOF2, highly recommend that you switch to WOF2. You can save somewhere between 15 and 30% by switching, just changing to a better font format. So if you've not done that, please go and do it. WOF2 is supported everywhere. It's the best format for fonts on the web. And if you're stuck supporting older browsers, you might want to consider using system fonts or fallback fonts instead of trying to manage all the legacy formats and having all that in your CSS. If you have to use TrueType fonts for any reason, I would highly suggest that you compress them using content encoding because they're not compressed by default, and as you saw, they're really big files. At Octopus Deploy, actually, when I was doing that audit, along with the entire Roboto family for the login button, I was actually able to remove nearly 2 meg of legacy font formats that we weren't using. And that was just under 7% of our bundle size. So, if you clean up your technical debt, you can get some savings as well. Now back to TextLab with my page weight, that was 1,972 kilobytes for a blog. This number was directly related to my fonts. I was nearly 70% of my page weight. That's really bad. I was so embarrassed when that number smacked me in the face. And the reason that it was so bad is because the 2 variable fonts that I was using were 754 kilobytes each. That's 1,508 kilobytes for a blog. Yikes. In my defense, because I am a bit of a variable font nerd, it was like 16 different styles, but it's still a lot. And when I looked at that number and was like, oh, this is so embarrassing, something really obvious jumped out to me that kind of made me feel even more shame. And that was that I was using Roslingdale, which is my font for headings, for bold, non-italic headings, which meant I was loading a 754 kilobyte variable font to render a single weight. So, as much as I love variable fonts, I got rid of it and replaced it with a single bold, standard bold font, which was only 67 kilobytes, which means I could immediately reduce that number by 91%. Now, while I am very pro variable fonts, only use them if you're going to be making the most of the features they provide. If not, you're just going to be loading unnecessary data into your website, which will end up in the situation that I had, and that's really terrible. So I couldn't use the same trick for Roboto Flex, but I did go and check. I was actually on GitHub that I downloaded it from to see if they had a new version of Roboto and if they had made it smaller. And they had. I was able to reduce the file by 5.7% just by downloading a new version and switching it out. Now, both of these changes took me about 10 minutes. So you can, granted, switching the variable font was the majority of it, but you can make some significant changes just by checking if there are new files to download. If you can't download it yourself, you can check with the Foundry that made the font. It won't always be smaller, but it's worth checking. So we are now at 778 kilobytes, which is nearly a 50% reduction. And again, most of that was the variable font, but we learn. Unfortunately, 778 kilobytes is still really, really big. So now we have to pull out the tools. And this is my favorite font tool on the entire internet, Waka My Fondue, which is an amazing name by Roll. And it's super, super cool. What you do is you dump your font in, and then it'll give you a whole bunch of information about the font on the page. So it's really, really cool. Highly recommend you check it out. Links are in my resources at the end, so don't worry too much about that. What I was interested in was the axes that existed within Roboto Flex. There are 13 of them. They do all sorts of stuff, but I'm only using these 5. So my theory was, if I dumped a bunch of the axes, it should be smaller. So to do that, I used a tool called Slice. Now, before you go and do this, make sure that your license allows you to modify fonts, because you can get in trouble if you violate your license. But if you are allowed to modify them, this is a great tool. It looks like this. You dump your font in, and you can either put the default value in, which they kindly give you in square brackets, and that will eliminate the axis from the variable font. You can leave it blank, and it'll do nothing, or you can put a new range in. So firstly, I'm going to eliminate the axes that I wasn't using, and I was able to reduce it by 7.3%. This isn't as much as I was expecting. I kind of thought it would be more because there were so many axes that I was dropping. But I figure it's because the data exists in those 5 that I'm using predominantly because they are the most common. So then I was like, okay, I'm going to have to, reduce the ranges as well. So I looked at the weight axis for RobotoFlex, which ranges from 100 to 1,000. And I didn't want to go through it on my CSS because it was going to take too long. So one of the things you can do is use the CSS overview tab in DevTools. It looks like this. You can kind of get through it through more tools, and it gives you some information about the fonts you're using and like occurrences of things in your page. Or what I did was I made a little stats thing using the CSS stats API, but restricted it down to just the text and font properties. And it will tell you how many times the property, if the property is used, what value, and how many times. So looking at font weight, I'm using from 400 to 700 in my CSS, which means I can immediately drop stuff from the beginning and the end of the axis. So that's what I did, and I used this tool to check the other axes as well and reduce them all to within the ranges that I was using, and was able to reduce it down to by 67%. So this is looking much better. We're now at 300 kilobytes, which is an 80% reduction in file size. So much better, thank you, yes, much better. But we still have subsetting left. If you're not familiar with subsetting, it's when you create a new version of the font containing only the glyphs that you want to use. Again, get permission before you do this. Not all licenses allow it. There's a great website called subsetting.xyz which gives you some information on this. Highly recommend you check it out. If you do have permission, there's some really great tools out there for subsetting. Zach Leatherman has Glyphhanger, which is my favorite. This is the one that I use predominantly. It's got heaps of configuration options. You can pass a Unicode range in. It's got like a crawler. You can put a website in, a set of characters, lots of features to use. It looks like this. At its simplest, you could do this if your language that you're subsetting is Latin-based. Always format to WOF2, please, as we've established. This will subset the font to just the Latin characters. This is a really quick way for you to subset if your language is Latin-based, so this is what I'm going to do. But before we do that, if you want to go a bit deeper and you want to get really specific about the characters that you're subsetting, Paul, who spoke yesterday, great talk, Paul, by the way, has this awesome tool called the Web Font Analyzer, and you put a web page test URL in, and it'll give you all sorts of information about the performance of your fonts, so definitely go and check that out. But there's one part of it that I really use quite a bit. It's got this little table that shows you the visible glyphs on the page and how many times they're used. This is really handy for maybe characters that are non-standard in the Latin subset. So, I don't know, like the little arrow that's down in the bottom right for you. Now, I might not need this to render in my custom web font, but if it is important that I need to render in the font, then you know you have to include that when you're subsetting. So tools like this are really, really handy to make sure that you're not excluding things that you might need. So on TextLab, I was able to reduce Rosingdale by 39%. And RobotoFlex by 55% by subsetting just to the Latin characters, which means I'm now at 145 kilobytes. This is a reduction of 90% from where I started, much, much better. It does equate to about 9 kilobytes per style, so I was pretty happy with this. At this point, I could spend a bit more time speaking to my designer, which is me, but, you know, and getting rid of some of those 16 styles that I was using. But I wanted to show you what you could do without having to involve a third party. You can do this without changing anything other than compressing everything. You don't have to, you know, negotiate with your designer about dropping stuff. You can just, you know, compress everything and not worry about that. But if you want to, you can go that far to make these files even smaller. Also, you can do some of these and not all of them. You know, you don't have to do it all in one. One day you could use WAF2 and the next day you could subset, you know, like you can do it piece by piece. It doesn't have to happen all at once. And it doesn't have to take a long time either. So, my page weight has dropped by 61%, and my fonts are now only 19% of the page weight. It is now images that are my biggest problem, which I think is how it should be, really. And that's my next problem that I need to look at. Now, before I move on from here, I wanted to quickly mention the incremental font transfer. This was published by the Web Fonts Working Group earlier this year. It's a working draft at the moment, and its aim is to load only the portion of the font that you need when the page loads. This is going to speed up loading time and reduce that data transfer. It also means that the font can be loaded over multiple requests, where each request is incrementally going to add additional data. So when this is available, it kind of eliminates the need for subsetting altogether. It's a really, really interesting feature. I've included a bunch of resources to go and check out in my link at the end. It's got some really great demos. Highly recommend looking into it. It's going to be really, really cool. I'm really excited about it. So the next thing I want to talk about is displaying fonts. Everything we've looked at so far is about less or smaller files. But we're always going to be faced with the same problem, whether you leave it invisible until the custom font has loaded, or if you have the text visible using a fallback and then you switch it out. And it's kind of that flash of invisible text, flash of unstyled text problem. And we manage this using font display, but each of the options of font display have some kind of trade-off between aesthetics and performance. Now, there used to be a bunch of ways that we could handle this with JavaScript. I am not going to talk about that because I think we can solve it without JavaScript these days, and we'll get to that as we go through the talk. What I will do is go through the different font display options so you can kind of see how each of them work. Essentially, it has a timer that begins the moment the user agent attempts to use the font face. They look like this. I will go through them in a little bit more detail. I'm going to skip auto because that's defined by the user agent. But before I do that, the Web Font Almanac shows that the most common font display property is swap, with block coming in second. The prevalence of block kind of surprised me a little bit because it's not really good from a UX or performance perspective. And the reason for that is it renders invisible text for up to 3 seconds, which is a really long time. And then at that point, it has an infinite swap period, allowing the web font to load in whenever. Typically, you'd pick this if the web font is critical to the experience of your web page. As a result, it's most often used for icon fonts because a fallback for an icon font is kind of useless. I don't personally think we should use icon fonts. I think you'd be better off using inline SVG or something like that. But if you are using icon fonts, block is typically the way to go. And the Web Font Almanac does support that because the majority of use cases for font display block are icon fonts. As an aside, if you're using emoji fonts, it doesn't have that problem because emojis encoded in Unicode, so you can use them with no problems. Now, outside of the outside of the icon fonts consideration, the other problem you have with this is that the invisible text is not just not there. It's actually rendered in the fallback text. So you can still get a layout shift with this because of that really long block period. So it's really not a great choice. Fallback is similar to block, but the block period is much shorter, to 100 milliseconds, and the swap period is only for 3 seconds. This is better, and the invisible text is less of a problem because usually that will have rendered before the initial paint. Now, the best option for performance is font display optional because it's got that really short block period of up to 100 milliseconds. If the web font is not loaded by that 100 milliseconds, it will load the fallback and it will never load the web font on that page render. It doesn't swap out at all. At this point, though, the font will be in the cache, so the next time it loads, it'll be really quick and it will load in. So this is why it's usually the choice if you want to prioritize performance. It's much better in the sense that your text loads really quickly and you get a better largest contentful paint as a result of that. Also, because the block period is only 100 milliseconds, you tend not to have the layout shift issues because the font is only loaded for the initial paint as well. So with TextLab, if I switched to font display optional, it eliminated my layout shift, which is really, really good. But I really like fonts, so I didn't want to do that for both of them. Instead, I decided that I needed to have my headings always render in Roslingdale, because the risk with optional is that it might not always render the font that you chose. So swap, being the most popular choice, has an infinite swap period. So it'll render your text in the fallback, and then it will swap out to the web font whenever it's ready. The problem with swap is that it almost always results in layout shift caused by fonts. So it's really good for slower connections in that the text is available immediately, but you do have that extra work of trying to solve the layout shift problems, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, as I said, for TextLab, I went for a mixed approach, swap for Roslingdale and optional for Roboto. So I still have some layout shift, which we'll look at fixing in a minute. One thing I do want to note, though, is if you've deemed your font not important for the rendering of the page, maybe you don't need a custom web font and you could just use a system font instead. But we're going to pretend I'm going to keep it. Well, I will keep it because I like the font. So the next thing we're going to cover is layout shift. Now, the reason that fonts cause layout shift is because there are almost always going to be differences between the custom font and the fallback font that you're using, whether it's different sizes, that kind of thing. Essentially, it can cause elements on the page to resize and text to reflow, moving everything around the page. Now, the way you can figure out layout shift using the new DevTools thing, really cool. Or like Web Page Test has the film strip view, which is what this is from. Or if it's really terrible, you can just see it when the page loads and it looks really awful and janky. So I've set up this little demo. It's my dog, Jello. Sir Gelatin. I'm using Oswald and Arial just so you can see how obvious it is, because Oswald's a lot narrower than Arial. And as you can see, as the text loads in, it jumps up and the page shifts. Now, the way that you manage this is using CSS, and we used to do it with things like line height and letter spacing, and Monica Dinkulescu had this really great tool for figuring it out, which is how I used to handle it. But now we have size adjust and font size adjust CSS properties. And they do slightly different things, but they both aim to render text in a similar way, regardless of the font that's being used. So the first one we'll look at is size adjust. You use this with font face, and it aims to adjust the X heights of the font. Without going into the deep anatomy of fonts, the X height represents the typical height of the lowercase letters. It is similar to the height of the X, but that is not always true. So in this case, it's the height from the baseline, so the bottom of the U, to the top of the U. It excludes the descenders and the ascenders, so the bottom of the Y and the top of the lowercase f's. So I made myself a little tool. It's up on TextLab. It's also on CodePen, just so I could kind of see how this worked. And as you can see, actually really good demonstration of why you get layout shift, because as the text sizes, you get reflow. And I just pulled the slider to try and match it to Oswald. So I landed on about 81%. One thing to note is that there's also the ascent override and descent override, which adjusts those ascenders and descenders. I won't go into them, but they're also really useful for this problem as well. There's also a really great tool by Multi-Ubel called Perfect-ish Font Fallback. It loads all of the Google fonts. You pick one, and it'll spit the font face out for you. I checked what he had for Oswald, and it was 81.66, so now my tool has decimals. Really awesome, highly recommend you check it out. The way that you use it, much like we create font face for our custom font, we're going to do the same thing for our fallback, in this case Arial, except we're going to give it a different name. I went with Arial fallback, but you could call it whatever makes sense to you. Jello would be a good name. For source, you use the local value with the name of the fallback font, Arial, and then you add your size adjust percentage, which we landed on 81%. For the font family, exactly the same as you normally would, but instead of just saying Arial, you give it the new Arial fallback instead. So as a reminder, this is where we started with the jankiness, and with size adjust, that's where we end up. Thank you. Yeah. So with size adjust, it is completely possible to significantly reduce or eliminate the layout shift issues. Now you're probably thinking, well, Mandy, why do we need font size adjust then? And the reason that we have font size adjust is this is applied slightly differently. Size adjust is, I guess, applied more globally at the font face level. Font size adjust is applied at the selector level. And it's similar to size adjust in that by default it'll match X heights, but it also has some other features. There's the ch width, there's cap height, there's IC width and IC height, which is for Korean, Japanese, and Chinese characters, and some other options. I'll use X height as an example because we've sort of talked about that already. And what it does, so here we've got Arial and Inter, and in this case Arial is narrower than Inter. What font size adjust does is try to render the fallback font at a size that's different to match the custom font. So in this case, we'll render Inter at 16 pixels and we'll render Arial at 20 so that they align. And the way that it figures this out is by taking the aspect ratio of the font, and then it does a calculation to figure out what the pixels or font size should be. How do you figure out what the aspect ratio is? Heaps of tools online. I like this one by Richard. Really simple. Chuck your font in. Pick the style, the weight, if optical size, and then hit calculate and it gives you the aspect ratio. It is really important that you fill in those other options because the aspect ratio can change depending on the style, the weight, etc. So I set this one up with Jello again. In this case, it's not as obvious, but now it expands past the line a little bit. So to fix this with font size adjust, you can set it up in your code like this. So we've got our font family, exactly like normal, no fancy font face. Our font size, 16 pixels for Inter. And then font size adjust, which is, this case is 0.516. And now when it loads, we have the same fix, no layout shift occurring. So the places that you would use font size adjust is if you've got a lot of variation in the font. So for example, with Roboto Flex, I use a bunch of different axes to change the stretch, the width, the optical sizing. So applying it at a global level is going to be a lot more difficult, whereas font size adjust at each of the places that I change the font variation settings allows me to have that more fine-grained control. One thing I do want to mention about layout shift is be really careful with relative units like the ch unit. I don't know if that's how you say it, but that's what I say. That unit is relative to the size of the 0 character in the font. So as your fonts shift, you're absolutely going to get a layout shift with that. And the reason is that it's going to change depending on what font you're using. Especially terrible if you use it for letter spacing. So just be careful of those units. You can adjust it with font size adjust. It's got a from font option and the ch width option, but it's a lot more difficult to manage. So if you're having a really hard time and you're using those units, you might want to consider getting rid of them. So for Text Lab, I only had to modify Roslingdale. I used size adjust because it was global and they were all the same. If I was going to apply it to Roboto, I would use font size adjust for the reasons that I mentioned just before. But I was able to eliminate the layout shift completely because it was all based on my fonts. So now we have no layout shift in the website at all. So To finish up, now that we've fixed our layout shift and we've got nice small file sizes, I'm going to talk about loading. Now, the first thing that you want to do, I'm going to say this the Australian way, you need to cache your fonts. And it's a very Aussie way of saying it. I'm very sorry if you want it the other way, but this is what we do. Now, because fonts are static and they're not typically updated regularly, it makes them ideal for long max age expiry in your headers. So make sure that you're caching your fonts. If you're not already, this will do it for a year, adjust to suit your needs. Really simple, easiest thing to do, will improve things quite a lot. And the other thing to know is that a font is only downloaded if it's referenced by the styling in the page, meaning your CSS needs the font face. It also needs a selector targeting an element that's on the page that references the font family. This means that how you set up your CSS can have an impact on how your fonts load. A simple solution to this is inlining your fonts in your critical CSS in the head of your HTML. Just make sure you're only doing this for fonts that you actually need right away. You don't want to inline all of your fonts if you're not using them straight away. I think this section kind of comes with the caveat of like, use with caution, because you can do bad things by doing it wrong, as Paul's performance mistakes talked about yesterday. You also want to make sure you prioritize the most important font first when you're inlining them, because that will kick it off quicker. You can also use resource hints. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here because Paul talked a bit about this yesterday, but also Robin's talk last year at this conference called Resource Loading at the Cutting Edge was so amazing. If you weren't here, even if you were, you should go and watch it. It's one of the best talks I've ever seen. Go check it out, really awesome. From a Web Font Almanac's perspective, pre-connect and DNS prefetch are the most commonly used, with preload coming in third. And the reason for this are primarily third parties, particularly Google, which uses pre-connect for speeding up the connection to the web font services. Preloading is the most commonly used for self-hosted fonts, and it is the most impactful, but as we've heard, it does come at the cost of deprioritizing other assets. Now, Paul mentioned this yesterday, use it with caution. Whether you use it really depends on your situation. It's really good for a small number of fonts. Not great if you've got a lot of really large fonts. And you also really don't want to be preloading your legacy fonts either. Only preload WAF2, please. So it's kind of a depends situation. I can't really tell you if it's right for you or not. Always test these things. You might find that inlining your CSS font declarations and adjusting your style sheets a bit might be a better strategy than preloading, so it's definitely a testing scenario. But, if you're interested, font loads down lower, starts at 1.32 seconds. With preload, it's a much higher priority and starts a lot quicker. Again, Australia, if you're wondering about these numbers, it's slower for us down there. This is how you use preload, which we saw yesterday. Really important you use the as font type so that it will preload. It also tells the browser what asset it is, and it helps with the prioritization. Also include the type, so in this case it would be WAF2. If the browser doesn't support that format, it won't try to preload it, which is really good. Most importantly, include the cross-origin attribute. If you don't, it will fetch it twice, it'll preload it, and then it'll forget, and it'll do it again. It doesn't matter if it's on a different origin or not, and that's because fonts are caused by default, so do make sure you add this on, otherwise you're just going to make everything worse. And if you're using like JSX, make sure you capitalize the O, because otherwise you'll be wondering why everything's so bad, which is what I did. It also depends on what you use for font display as to whether you use preload, and Paul talked a bit about this yesterday. You don't want to be preloading something that you have deemed not important. When you Google this, it's really confusing because everybody says something different. And a really good example of that is font display optional. Some places say you should definitely preload font display optional, and some places say no, you shouldn't preload font display optional. In my experience from testing this stuff, particularly with font display optional, I kind of landed on the side of don't preload it. Come and tell me if I'm wrong. But the reason that I was on that side of the fence is that the font is either already in the cache, so preloading it is a waste of bandwidth, or it's not likely to load quickly enough and you're going to get your fallback font anyway. So again, it's kind of a waste of resources. So you're better off assigning that bandwidth to other more important resources that you want to load, given that it's probably not going to make that much of a difference. So I guess what I would say about that is don't preload and pre-connect all the things. Consider it against your other assets. Make sure that you're testing. It's going to vary for your situation, what kind of fonts you've got, what other assets you have. This kind of performance optimization can't be done in isolation, like compressing files can. You have to think more holistically. So it's kind of hard to say what you should and shouldn't do. Just do your best is probably how I would approach it. So to recap, we ended up here. No layout shift, 61% reduction in page rate, and my LCP dropped by 33%, all by optimizing my fonts. So I sped this up to normal loading time to remind you what it was like, but it's not as painful this time. So in case you missed it, that's what it is. Not too bad, but it's a little bit janky. But with the optimized version, that's it. It's much better, right? And this is a blog, so doesn't take a long time to load. So if you can imagine on your much more complicated, much more serious websites, you can find that you can improve things quite drastically just by looking at fonts. Now, just to summarize everything that I've just said, just to make everything I've talked about totally useless, you want to self-host as few probably variable WAF2 fonts as possible that have been sliced if they're a variable font, subset, and maybe preloaded. They'll be cached, and you'll either swap or probably optionally display them. And you want to make sure you're either using font size adjust or the size adjust CSS properties to reduce that layout shift, or hopefully eliminate it altogether. The other option is to use system fonts. So thank you so much for listening. This is my obligatory Jello picture and my resources up on GitHub. The choice is yours, how much you want to do, how deep you want to go. When you're applying these strategies, do all of them, do some of them. But a few simple approaches, they don't have to be time-consuming, and you can definitely improve your performance by doing all of this stuff. So thank you so much. My resources are online.
Thank you so much, Mandy. Come have a seat.
Thank you. Hang on one second.
Oh gosh, my voice is like progressively getting worse as the day goes on. I apologize.
I'm so happy that I put Jello on this slide so you can all look at him.
So how is Jello? Is Jello being taken care of while you're here?
Oh yeah, he's with my mum, so he gets to do whatever he wants.
Awesome. Okay, so a couple of questions have come in. We're not going to have time for all of them, unfortunately, so folks will have to grab Mandy at the next break. So the first question is, do you recommend self-hosting web fonts on your CDN or on your origin?
I think it depends on how you set things up. Either is fine, but if you're going to self-host on the CDN, that's when you want to use things like pre-connect rather than, not at all. So it just kind of depends on what your approach is. I don't really think there is a right or wrong there. Just make sure that you're probably using pre-connect. It's so hard to say if you should or not because everyone's situation is different, but that would probably be how I would do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think really a lot of it depends on if your CDN is hosted through the same origin or not. Yep. So, there were a couple of questions that came in that were sort of around subsetting and predicting the future. So what happens if you subset a font to load only Latin, but then someone uses like Google Translate and they translate to a different language. What do you do if you subset characters that you don't need now, but maybe you need them in the future?
Yeah, so it's not like it won't render anything. It'll just render in the fallback font. So it might not look as nice, but you'll still get text. So yeah, if you find that that's happening, then you probably want to go and adjust your subsetting. Also, if you're, rendering, how sometimes you change the language, you could just load that font in when you need it, and you can subset to the different languages and only render them when you need them. But you're not going to end up with nothing if you've accidentally subset and excluded a character. It'll just look slightly different because it'll be in the fallback font.
Yeah,
so
makes sense.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Mandy.
Thank you.
That was an excellent talk. I learned a lot.